video is a slight departure from my usual reaction videos. A lot of the time I'm looking at people's top 10 of Australia or people's reactions to Australia, you know, what people from overseas think of Australia, etc. But if you've been around for a while with my channel, you may have realised that I also have quite a passion for Australian history. And this video came up in my feed last night and I started watching it and I thought this would actually be a really good reaction video. So the video is an Australian talking about their experience post Cyclone Tracy. So for those of you who maybe need to be brought up to speed, in the early hours of Christmas morning 1974, Cyclone Tracy hit Darwin. The wind speeds were up to 217 kilometres an hour. And as a result, over 80% of the city was destroyed. There were 66 deaths, 145 serious injuries, and over 500 minor injuries. The damage bill at the time was over $800 million. I can't even begin to imagine what that would equate to in today's terms, but that's a lot of money. While the plan was for a 5-year rebuild, it took 3 years to rebuild Darwin. And one small positive that has come from it is that there were new regulations brought into place in terms of building standards so that subsequent cyclones in the past 50 years have not had the same effect that Cyclone Tracy has had. And hopefully there won't be another cyclone disaster on par with Cyclone Tracy. So let's have a look at this video looking at the after effects of Cyclone Tracy.
Coming out of our laundry area there, the washing machine, I think it tipped over. No, maybe it hadn't. One of the cupboards had fallen over anyway. And there was stuff strewn across the floor. We sort of pushed it to one side and climbed over bits and pieces and went out to see what was going on. And noticed that our house was still basically standing. One wall on the western side, I think it was. The side facing Cashew in the shopping centre anyway, up the Trail Road end, was leaning out. And Dad's boat was parked just underneath and it hadn't fallen on the boat and he was hugely relieved. And there'd been damage to the roof. Apparently my mother had told my sister sometime later that when she was in the kitchen, a stick of timber flew past her, and that's when she decided to forego any more cooking and go and get Dad up and get us all out.
It seems like this amazing juxtaposition to have her talking about their house being mostly intact and how a wall nearly came down on her father's boat but didn't quite. And then we're looking at these pictures of utter devastation. And this picture that I'm looking at now, you can see a set of stairs that go up to nothing. And she's talking about it all so calmly. And she's talking about her mum continuing to cook in the kitchen up until the point when a bit of timber goes flying past her, at which stage she's like, wow, this is real. I just can't even begin to imagine what sort of experience that must have been. You know, it was really, really early on Christmas morning. It would be the last thing that you would expect to experience.
But the houses around us had been basically demolished. Our next door neighbour's place, Roy and Nola Smith, they were away on holidays with their kids and all their stuff was strewn everywhere. I remember going out with Mum and picking through the stuff and Mum had a real sense of mementos and keepsakes and saying, these photos are not too badly damaged, pick them up. I can dry those ones out. Pick up these things, you'll want this, sports trophies, things like that. And so we spent some time collecting the stuff for them.
That's so very Australian, isn't it? She's talking about damage to their own house on one hand, and then she's talking about how their family was out salvaging whatever they could for their next door neighbours who were away. And, that to me is the essence of Australia. That whole looking after people when the chips are down.
And Jerry Rowe, the footballer, lived behind us, or his widow lived there, because I think he died not long before the cyclone. And checking to see that they were okay. It was just looking around, having a look at what was going on, sussing out what we had, how were we going to collect the water, because we'd been told not to touch the water mains. And we decided that we'd use the rubbish bins, and I don't know where they came from. Maybe Mum cleaned them out in a hurry, I don't know, but the plastic 56 litre bins they are now, we used those and we'd get the water off the roof, and that was water that we used for washing, for cooking. If we wanted to drink it, Mum would boil it up. We'd just collect the rainwater, and that was going to be the water we needed. We'd work that out. Dad had been a fisherman and going on fishing trips. We had the camping burners for cooking, so we had gas. We had a freezer stocked with food, and the stuff in the freezers kept for about 4 days.
I think a lot of what we hear about Cyclone Tracy seems to miss this aftermath side of things. For me, I hadn't even considered that people could be stuck there. This is 50 years ago when it was harder to evacuate all these people from a city that was completely destroyed. And all these people who were left having to fend for themselves in a place where they had no water and most of them had no power or gas. So to me, it just seems amazing thinking of these people having to rely on water that they've collected from their roof and having to live off food out of a freezer that is gradually defrosting, and you would know that it's only going to go so far. And even having the gas top from fishing, you'd still only have limited amounts of gas. So, wow, it's just unfathomable thinking what it must have been like for these people.
With the chest freezer, open the lid, and the stuff would stay frozen and keep everything else. So we knew we had food for about 4 or 5 days, and it wasn't going to be too big of a problem. And the food that Mum had cooked, plenty to go around the neighbourhood.
And again, so Australian. They obviously saw themselves as the fortunate ones. So the food that they've got, they're sharing with everyone in the neighbourhood. Meaning that sooner or later, they were going to run out of food. But at least everyone in the neighbourhood was eating. It's pretty amazing.
But anyway, in all of this, somewhere along the line, we noticed that our chooks, because we had some chooks, were in a heap, looking absolutely dead, smelling of damp feathers, lifeless. And Dad said, well, looks like we're going to have to dig a hole and bury them. I'll do that later. And he disappeared. And for the next 3 days, I don't know how much sleep he got, because we hardly ever saw him. And I don't know whether he slept much at all. I often say that the next 72 hours he didn't sleep. He might have grabbed an hour or two here and there, But it was full on for Dad. He was back at work with the evacuation, with organising things, him and Jack Anderson and Ian Shepherd and quite a few other people, Noel Liner, George Redman, a lot of the old senior officials in the government, all involved in this. And anyway, 2 days later, these chooks still hadn't been buried, and Mum was beginning to complain, and we noticed that one of them started to move, and then another one. And before too long, these chooks had dried out and come back to life again. We had all our chooks. Mum said, right, there's fresh meat and there's fresh eggs. So
That's unreal. I wouldn't have actually thought that chooks were that hardy, but clearly they were. They must have just huddled together during that time, and I guess the people around them didn't have enough time to pay that much attention to them, and just presumed because of the way they were huddled in a damp blob that they were no longer living. And they must have survived using each other's body heat. So just that was a fascinating story. When I first listened to the video, I thought I'm going to have to edit this bit out because I thought she was going to be talking about dead chooks, and I didn't really want to go down that road. But it turned out to be a happy story, kind of.
the chooks actually survived. So now when I see a wet chook, I tell everybody, wait. The other thing we also noticed too after Tracy was that we had a huge bumper crop of lemons and limes on our citrus bushes in the backyard. A bumper crop, big fleshy fruit on long stems. And someone had said that the mango stems that year had been extra long, and it's said by the Aboriginals at the time that was an indication that there was a big storm coming. And, the birds disappearing and all. And I know that now whenever there's a cyclone in the wind and they say how strong it is, Category 5, I can still hear the birds. No, it's not going to be too big a problem. The mango stems, no, they're not as long. These things still stick around as an indicator of the strength of the cyclone.
I love hearing old bushy stories. The mango stalks were really long, so that was a sign that there was going to be a storm. I was always told by an old bushie that lived near me that you could always tell that there was going to be an early spring, or that it was going to be a good spring, from the wattles. So if you've got wattles that are just so overladen that they're just bending down, it's going to be a good spring. And you can tell by when wattles start to come out whether it's going to be an early spring or not. Now, it's hard to tell in this fuzzy photo, but that looks like a Datsun 180B in front of the old ute, which is kind of amusing because who knew that they existed without being covered in rust?
With Tracy, there was a huge amount of debris on the road. Iron, twisted poles, wood, splintered wood, clothing. And people were riding up and down the road in cars, and the tyres had popped, and they were just driving on the hub, and they were going anywhere to check out who was still around, what was the damage. And people might say that it's curiosity, that there is a term for it, and they do it now. Whenever there's a disaster, everyone flocks to see what it is to sticky beak. But I think it's also a genuine need to go and see that someone's okay, to go and see that something survived, or to go and view the extent of the damage, to congratulate yourselves that you've survived, that your place isn't as badly off. There are lots of reasons, emotional reasons, and for emotional security that people do this. But I used to marvel at these cars with no tyres, bump, 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 down the road.
She's not wrong. It is a kind of an emotional coping mechanism. to go and actually see it for yourself, to be able to really absorb what has happened. And I'd imagine, especially for people, if their houses are intact, then just to try and take in the scope of the whole thing would be, you would have that need to have the visual prompts to help you absorb what had happened, because it would be so hard to understand and so unfathomable. I can remember going back maybe 10 years ago, there were bushfires on the Tasman Peninsula, and they started south of uh, Carlton, I think. Basically, where they started, it meant that everybody from south of where the fires started was stuck on a peninsula, and all they could do was keep heading south and hope that sooner or later the fires were contained. And a town called Dunalley was totally devastated. So many houses were lost. The school burnt down. Many businesses were lost. And it was really traumatic for a lot of people who lived on the peninsula. And I had a friend who lived just north of where the fire had started. So she was, in the safe zone. And a few weeks after the fires, she wanted me to go for a drive with her down to Dunalley to check it out. And at the time, I was, internally, I was a bit critical. I thought, well, she just wants to go rubberneck. And I hadn't twigged until we got down there and I could see the way she was reacting to it, that for her, there was this sort of a trauma response. This sense that she had escaped all this, and had she lived a little bit further south, maybe she could have lost her home, she could have lost everything. And you could see there was this real emotional reaction to to the devastation that had occurred. So I totally understand what this lady is saying.
Looking, and people trying to get water out of the fire hydrants with buckets, with rubbish bins, until they were told don't use them. And then there was the looting in the shops. Well, before there was the looting, people had gone up to Casuarina to have a look at the damage, because that was a huge shopping centre for our day. And my brother had also gone up on his bicycle to have a look, and he came back with these bags with dog food in them, and he said, "Mum, there's people up there getting stuff out, and they've all been told that they can take whatever they want, and I brought back some dog food for the dog." And Mum said, "Oh, that's good, but don't go back." He said, "Why not, Mum? There's plenty there." "No, don't go back." And then she said, "Look after the dog, because they're going to go around and they're going to come shooting dogs soon," because she'd been warned that this might happen.
Okay, I know things were different 50 years ago, and that they would never consider something like that these days. But that really upset me. They'd have to shoot me before they shot my dogs. There's no way I would ever allow any harm to come to my dogs in a situation like that. Like, wow. Imagine going through the trauma of this horrible cyclone and then finding out that they want to come around and they're going to shoot your dog as well.
And we had a cage that we used to keep our pet rabbits in until we discovered that they could dig. And we had multiple litters of rabbits under the ground until we got rid of them all and gave them away. So anyway, we put the cats into the cage, and then we'd have the dog chained up, and at night the dog would go into the cage or would go in wherever Mum and Dad were, because people came looking for the dogs to take them away to shoot them. And it didn't matter whether they were caged or not, and Mum would not leave the house because she said as soon as I leave the house, someone's going to come and shoot the dog. And so Mum stayed there. And we heard about the evacuation going on, and we wondered what was going to happen. Were we going to be evacuated? And I guess, in a way, it was the sense of excitement, this huge journey, this evacuation. In some way, there was a sense of a romantic lure to it, and when's our evacuation going to be? And, yep. So anyway, I think it was about 3 days in that Dad came and told Mum that we're going to be evacuated, and just the kids, because Mum said she wouldn't go, she would stay with Dad. And because we're only allowed to take a little bit, we had our TAA Ansett Airway school bags, which were just big enough to put in foolscap size folders and some books. We shoved them full of bits and pieces that we could. We each had our school bags, 3 layers of clothing on, a pair of shoes on our feet. My sisters grabbed a favourite toy. I had bought myself a little portable sewing machine about the time of Selma, just after school finished. It was my money that I'd saved up, and so I grabbed that. I left my guitar behind. I bought another one when I got down south. And then we were taken, and I can't remember whether my father came and got us or whether someone else came and got us and took us to the airport. But we got to the airport, and there were thousands of people, hundreds of people there, milling around, people with huge, huge suitcases, men and women, and they were pushing and shoving and streaming out, and we waited.
She does mention further in that she was 18 at this point in time, and she was responsible for her younger siblings. I can't imagine how overwhelming it would have been to be at the airport and to be surrounded by all these people who were so intent on seeing to their own needs and getting away from the area, and to be limited to just this small amount of baggage. Like, what an experience to go through.
And we waited. And then finally, just before the end of the day, they put us on a plane, and they literally shoved us out, hunted us along, got us as quickly as possible out there. I can't remember whether they picked us up and put us on the trolley or whether my sisters got dumped on the trolley because they were little. But anyway, we got out there and then into the plane, and there were children everywhere. The seats, normally 3 seats in a row on one side and 2 on the other side. We were sitting 5 adults. If you had a seatbelt, you had a seatbelt. If you didn't, you wedged yourself in. Then we were nursing children on our laps. And there still seemed to be babies on the floor, babies under the seats. And I know that there was a friend in a wheelchair who'd been taken down towards the back of the plane, and other people there with injuries. And I sat next to a girl who was also a similar age to myself. I was 18 at the time, and she was heading back down south. She'd been up on holidays, and she was going home. We were heading off towards Sydney, and I think we stopped in Brisbane first and then went from Brisbane to Sydney.
From what she's saying about the overcrowding on the planes, it's utterly amazing that they made it anywhere. It's amazing that they made it off the ground. Can you imagine the uproar today if they were to try and overload planes like that? They would do things far differently today than how they did after Cyclone Tracy, because obviously these days there is still the whole safety issue at the forefront, so those sort of evacuations would no longer occur.
But in the meantime, my father had got a message out to his mum to say that we were all well, that we were okay, because at that point they assumed that we were dead, because they hadn't heard and nobody knew at the time that there was no way of getting a message out. and I can't remember whether Dad got this through an airline, someone to radio it through from the plane, or whether it was one of the first radios working. But he got this message out, and they were all waiting for us to turn up. And when we got to Sydney, well, actually leaving Darwin, it seemed like the plane was never, ever going to leave the ground. It just seemed to have this weight, and it just couldn't quite make it into the ground. And just before the end of the runway, it lifted. And we were in the air, but I kept waiting for it to drop out of the sky. It was just felt that heavy. We found out afterwards it was one of the heaviest ones. I don't know whether it was the heaviest or not, but it was certainly overloaded. And when we got to Sydney eventually, there was then the stress of all these people around us wanting to know all this information. Who are you? Where'd you come from? Have you done this? Have you done that? And before you could say an answer, someone else would come in and ask another question. And someone realised after a while that we weren't going to be able to answer all these questions, and sat down with us, and we just kept saying, we want to go here, we've got to go there, and where do they live, and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, we filled out registration cards. We found the number of a friend in the phone book, and they organised the government taxi to take us out to our friend who lived at Carramar.
Talk about re-traumatising people. Can you imagine how traumatic that kind of experience would be? It sounds like they arrived in Sydney, but there wasn't anything particular in place for these refugees. So they basically had to fend for themselves and try and figure out what to do with themselves. Imagine if you arrived there and you didn't know anyone. You had no family or friends down there. I wonder what happened to those people.
We stayed with them for a couple of days. We rang our grandparents and our aunts and our uncles in Woy Woy, and then organised to get on the train to go out to Woy Woy to stay with them. And while we were in Woy Woy, I thought I was the one who had responsibility of my siblings. I was 18, I had a job, I had a little bit of money, and I didn't know anything about government handouts or anything like that, or unemployment benefits. I just thought we had to make do with what we had, and all I had was $700. I'm thinking, how long am I going to support the family like this? And we went to the Salvation Army centres to get this clothing that had been donated for the victims of Cyclone Tracy. And sifting through the stuff and saying to my sisters, right, that'll do, that's clean enough, that'll do, that's clean enough. Here's a pair of shoes, a pair of sneakers. And remember them looking down their nose at me and saying, what? You want us to wear that stuff? It's second-hand stuff. Anyway, I got really stressed out about this because I was still worrying about the money and how to look after them, even though we were staying with relatives.
I'm not surprised she became stressed out. Imagine being 18. I know that sounds grown up and it's considered an adult, but really, when you're living at home and you've just finished school, to suddenly find yourself in a position where you are essentially having to act as a parent to your older siblings, that's got to be hard. And I'd imagine that, yeah, as an 18-year-old, you wouldn't really know the way of the world and know that there was handouts available. So I feel really sad for that 18-year-old girl that she was, and the amount of stress that she must have gone through.
And my sisters complained to my parents over the phone one day, and I thought my parents had come down to rescue my sisters, but they hadn't. They'd come to get them, to take them home. And I then had to go on to uni, but I was then separated from my siblings and sent to another aunt to stay, where the siblings couldn't come and torment me and demand me to buy them this and to buy them that. And I felt really, I felt a little bit of an insult, a bit of an injustice at the time, but, I found out afterwards that there were government handouts, And gradually all this thing came to pass, but by the time it all happened, it wasn't necessary because I was on my way to uni, to Canberra, and my father had organised for me to stay with some work colleagues that he knew, and I stayed with them for a few months before getting myself sorted in my accommodation there as well.
Wow, what an experience to go through. And I think, she's saying that she was a bit upset about her siblings being taken away and taken back home. I think that would have actually been quite traumatic. As challenging and stressful as it would have been having to care for her siblings, that also at the same time would have been some comfort, a bit of home. And even with the stress of the responsibility, it was still those family connections. So it would have been re traumatising to then have them taken back home, and then you are to head back on to university at a time when, as much as it would have been a struggle having to be the responsible adult, there certainly would have been a comfort from everything that they had just gone through. The removal of that last little bit of familiarity, and to suddenly find yourself isolated. It just sounds quite challenging. So I found this video really interesting. Like I said, we've heard a lot about the devastation of Cyclone Tracy, but to hear someone's personal story, I think just makes it so much more real for me. So yeah, I found it really interesting and a little bit saddening. I'd love to know what people think of this video. What's your reaction to all this? Um, were you around when Cyclone Tracy occurred? Have you heard talk of it from family members? Or is it something like me where it's really just something that is part of the Australian collective memory, but you didn't really know a great deal about the effects on the people involved? So thanks for listening. Please hit the like button. If you're new, please subscribe, and also please do leave a comment below.